Good morning, everyone. Anybody knows me, I have way better reading comprehension when I read aloud, and I'm starting a book today that I've been wanting to read for a long time. It's been recommended by a number of friends, including my gong teacher, Michael J. So today I'm going to start reading it. If you want to read it yourself, it's available free PDF online. God is Read by Vine Deloria. But it's been 50 years. This was the 30th edition. God is Read, A Native View of Religion by Vine Deloria Jr. It's published by Fulcrum Publishing in Golden, Colorado. First published in 1973. I was 10 years old. So I posted the table of contents. We'll start today with the introduction, the foreword. The foreword is by Leslie Marmon, Silko, Laguna, Pueblo, author of Ceremony and Almanac of the Dead. No one who reads Vine Deloria Jr.'s books remains neutral. Vine's books influenced our generation and are as important to United States cultural history as are the books of Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe. This will be appreciated by future generations when U.S. history ceases to be fabricated for the glory of the white man. What influenced me as a young writer was his defiant attitude toward the power elites, whether it be Christianity or the U.S. military. But Vine's was a special sort of defiance that depended on the warmth of Indian humor and the rule of international law, never the threat of violence. The publication of God is Read was anxiously awaited by all of us. Vine was our hero. Courageously and eloquently, Vine expressed what a great many of us Indians felt and thought. His writing spoke for generations past and generations yet to come. It took great personal courage to speak out like Vine did back then. Remember, assassins took down Dr. King, Malcolm X in those years. I couldn't wait to see what Vine had to say about Christianity as the cause of the great weakness of the United States. Vine had identified America's great weakness in his 1969 bestseller, Custer Died for Your Sins. Consider the history of America closely. Never has America lost a war. When engaged in warfare, the United States has always applied the principle of overkill and mercilessly stamped its opposition into the dust. Consider Vietnam, where the United States has already dropped more bombs than it did during the last war, a classic of overkill. But if you can, but name if you can, the last peace the United States won. Victory, yes, but this country has never made a successful peace because peace requires exchanging ideas, concepts, thoughts, and recognizing the fact that two distinct systems of life can exist together without conflict. Consider how America seems to be facing its allies of one war as new enemies. In God is Read, Vine explains how Christianity is the root cause of this great weakness of the United States, the inability to respect or tolerate those who are different. Clearly, this weakness of the United States has only worsened in recent years, with wars against former allies Manuel Noriega, Saddam Hussein, and Osama bin Laden, and friction with the French and the Germans. Americans would do well to read God is Read again, to be reminded what happened in the 1960s and 70s is that the logic of Western culture and the meaning of the Christian worldview that supported the institutions of Western culture were outrun by the events of time. Indeed, Christianity was so weak, God was dead. The Indian joke on bumper stickers was, "Hey, God is red. She isn't dead." God has always been red on these continents called the Americas. And God, Mother Earth God, and the religions of the indigenous communities of the Americas are alive and thriving. Vine points out the failure of the Christian conscience. We conducted a long war in Asia that was prolonged primarily for political reasons by 2 presidents. Yet, both of these men were apparently Christians in good standing. Prominent church leaders such as Billy Graham did not call them to account as being anti-Christian or non-Christians for the wastage of human life. In the Gulf War, some church leaders did make an effort to prevent bloodshed, but their religious objections proved irreverent to George Bush Sr. God is Red refuses to let Christians off the hook. If the exploiters of old were not Christians, why did not the true Christians rise up in defiance of the derogation of their religious heritage and faith? At this point in the clash between Western industrialism and the planet's Aboriginal peoples, we find little or no voice coming from the true Christians to prevent continued exploitation. As accurate and prophetic as it was 30 years ago, God is Red should be read and reread by Americans who want to understand why the United States keeps losing the peace, war after war. We Indians, we don't disappear, but Deloria predicts the end of European expansion in the world and concludes, who will find peace with the lands? The future of humankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibilities to all living things. Who will listen to the trees, the animals and birds, the voices of the places of the land, as the long-forgotten peoples of the respective continents rise and begin to reclaim their ancient heritage? They will discover the meaning of the lands of their ancestors. This is when the invaders of the North American continent will finally discover that for this land, God is red. That reminds me of the work that reconnects, which includes the Council of All Beings, where people gather to speak for beings that might not have the language that we have. And now the foreword by George E. Tinker, Osage, Cherokee. And there's a podcast on, I'll try to put it in a link, of George E. Tinker talking about the 50th anniversary of this book, which is what inspired me, part of what inspired me to get back to reading it. He is a professor of American Indian cultures and religious traditions at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. George Tinker. Coyote Old Man has always been a teacher, a wily man of the world who combines perspicuity, vision, and intuition with a sense of the ironic. Even in moments of feigned foolishness and individualism, Coyote is the people's teacher and is committed to their well-being. Vine Deloria Jr. is not Coyote Old Man. Yet, like Coyote, he is the commensurate teacher whose sometimes outrageous intellectual gift to the Indian world has and still inspires young Indian intellectuals today. At the time of its initial publication, God is Red both systematized and gave voice to a general American Indian thought. As such, it was and continues to represent an important first for Native people. It covers a huge intellectual waterfront, modeling a systemic, coherent Indian response to the fundamentals of Euro-Western historiography, philosophy, theology, social criticism, and political theory. But this book is more than a systemized introduction to American Indian thinking. In large part, God is Red is a critical reflection on Western thought and culture, an American Indian ethnography of Amero-European intellectual and religious lifeways, if you will. As a result, the book's greatest contribution is that it seriously stirs the pot. Again and again, Deloria demonstrates the inadequacy of various Western modes of scholarship, offering shocking and almost scandalous new ways of understanding the evidence. At the same time, he demonstrates that his own hermeneutical reflection, I don't have a dictionary, hermeneutical, we're going to have to take a little pause here. Hermeneutical of or pertaining to hermeneutics. I love that. It's a great definition. The study or theory of the methodical interpretation of texts, especially holy texts. Hermeneutics. I wonder what the origins are. Is the theory and methodology of interpretation, especially the interpretation of biblical texts, wisdom, literature, and philosophical texts. Hermeneutics is more than interpretive principles or methods used when immediate comprehension fails and includes the art of understanding communication. Uh-huh. At the same time, he demonstrates his own hermeneutical reflection. Extraordinary though it may seem, it is actually no more preposterous than the generally accepted solutions offered in Western scientific and social scientific explanations of the world. Suddenly, the explanations offered by critical biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholarship for pyramid building in ancient Egypt, memorialized cinematically by Cecil B. DeMille, seem equally or even more fantastic and implausible than Deloria's own. Insofar as these so-called scientific explanations of the world have been used to signify American Indian existence in terms controlled and controllable by the settler colonizers in North America, Deloria's hypotheticals stand as powerful and useful challenge. More to the point, in God is Red, Deloria makes minimal concessions to explicit categories of cognition, common to those Western traditions, modeling instead the existence and articulation of enduring natural categories of Indian cultures themselves that are foundational for tribal existence and for tribal intellectual and religious traditions. Thus, the book continues to be a forceful challenge to the presumed inherent hegemony of the Western intellectual tradition. It is in this very exercise that the book began and will continue to teach many bright Indian youth, a future generation of Indian scholars, the validity of our own cultures and the resources, categories of knowledge, and modes of discourse already at our disposal for reasoned analytical thought. The book's singular achievement, for instance, was its systematic and consistent analysis of the distinction between spatiality and temporality as culturally discrete ways of being in the world. In a sense, nearly every Indian person had already noticed this difference, this important difference between tribal Native American peoples and the Amero-European settler population. Yet the difference was little discussed in the literature until Deloria finally and irrevocably named it. Likewise, Deloria spelled out the communitarian individualist difference between Indian and Euro-Western cultures. These category distinctions are now the foundation for any genuine analytical understanding of any particular Indian culture and for Indian intellectual thought in general. In God is Red, Deloria proposes an etiology for what he sees as the fundamental philosophical difference between tribal peoples and cultures on the one hand, and others whom he describes as hybrid peoples. In typically provocative Deloria fashion, he demonstrates that a historical interpretation that assumes an alien invasion of superior culture explains much of ancient Near Eastern biblical history as well or better than the standard so called scientific explanations. A wildly outrageous proposition to some. The point is that these same historical methods are used then by non Indian scholars to interpret and explain American Indian realities. To put the matter boldly from an American Indian perspective, if the assured results of the historical critical method of Western scholars are less than assured in dealing with their own sacred texts, then perhaps Indians are not so far off base in thinking that their scholarship about us is also suspect. Deloria's more philosophical theological work is not limited in its impact to Indian people, but continues to be instructive to those who function largely within Western intellectual tradition. I fully expect that Deloria's continuing contribution to the American Indian scholarship will become increasingly important to the Academy and to the development of articulation of modern Indian thought. Outside of the Academy, where he taught so many years, Deloria's leadership has been freely given over time to both American Indian organizations and to non-Indian groups that have impacted or had the potential to impact Indian people. The guidance and support he continues to provide to younger Indian scholars is invaluable. God is Red amply shows an Indian intellectual mind at work. Anyone genuinely interested in the lifeways of American Indian peoples needs to read and indeed study this seminal work. Introduction. When I was very small and traveling with my father in South Dakota, he would frequently point out buttes, canyons, river crossings, and old roads and tell me their stories. In those days, before interstate highways, when roads were often two ruts alongside of a fence, it was possible to observe the places up close, and so indelible memories accrued around certain features of the landscape because of proximity of the place and because of the stories that went with them. He seemed to remember details that other people had missed or never knew. He could point out buttes where vision quests were held, the hill near Standing Rock where the woman lived with the wolves, and obscure landings along the Missouri where people crossed, or where Jack Sully, shirt-tail relative and famous bandit, escaped from a posse. I came to revere certain locations and passed the stories along as best I could. Although visits to these places were very few and far between, it seemed to me that the remembrance of human activities at certain locations vested them with a kind of sacredness that could not have been obtained otherwise. Gradually, I began to understand a distinction in the sacredness of places. Some sites were sacred in themselves. Others had been cherished by generations of people and were now part of their history, and as such revered by them and part of their very being. As the Indian protest movement gained momentum and attracted many young people to its activities, much of the concentration of energies was devoted to the restoration of sacred sites and the resumption of ceremonies there. God is Red did not receive much of a welcome when it hit the bookstores upon its release in 1973. And since it was something of a departure from what I had written earlier. It was not even reviewed by most Indian journals and newspapers. Nevertheless, as people tried to give voice to the concerns over getting lands back and gaining better access to sacred sites located on public lands, the book provided a framework in which the demands for lands made sense. As important as the concern for lands was the need for an affirmation that American Indians had their own tribal religious traditions and did not need to be homogenized among other religions. I am most grateful to those people, Indian and non-Indian, who gave the book a chance and tried to see its message. Over the years, it has become useful to people of all tribes, and it is a handy place to find a quasi-philosophical view of what the sacred might mean to Indian people. Over and over, I encounter people who found the book to be useful to them in directing their path back to a more tribal and spiritual existence. The book has led me on in my search for a way to understand the power and spiritual capabilities of our ancestors. Reflecting back on the old men, I observed as a boy and the utter sincerity of their belief, their humility and hesitancy to rush forward with answers to important questions. In writing the book, I was led back to the great appreciation of our religious traditions. Since writing the book, I have been gradually led to believe that the old stories must be taken literally, if at all possible. The deep secrets and a deeper awareness of the complexity of our universe was experienced by our ancestors, and that something of their beliefs and experiences can be ours once again. Black Elk speaks in his vision. Black Elk speaks, it's a book. Black Elk in his vision saw many hoops of many people. And we always recognize that there are other traditions with their ceremonies, so that sacredness is not restricted to any particular group of people and their beliefs. Yet an examination of tribal traditions will show that Indian paths to an encounter with the great mystery of life were generally straight and fulfilling. Almost any tribe can be examined, and the result will be a bevy of stories about how people use spiritual powers to live, and these powers are almost always made available to us in a sacred place where time and space do not define the terms of the experience. Our perception of the physical world is in rapid change today. And many of the old stories about separate physical dimensions in which spirituality reigns supreme now sound possible, if not probable. I can now find justification and a possible explanation for the old stories that say a tribe came from the stars or emerged from some mysterious underground location. As I have gained knowledge and seen others share their visions with me, I conclude that our ancestors lived in a strange condition in which they were in touch with the spirits constantly. And I see that as a goal for our present activities. Space, as defined in this book, is determinative of the way that we experience things. Time is subservient to it, because to have time, there must be a measurable distance to travel during which time can pass. Thus, to say the world has many sacred places, worlds under or within mountains, caves that come and go according to the kinds of ceremonies conducted at certain locations, these things now interest me, and I believe have attracted others to more closely examine our religious heritage. It is this unbroken connection that we have with the spirit world that will allow us to survive as a people. Chapter 1: The Indian Movement. Until 1890, American Indians played a critically important role in the American domestic affairs, symbolizing the vast wilderness and frontiers that America wished to tame. From the 1890s until the 1960s, Indians were truly the vanishing Americans. And most people believed that the tribes had largely been exterminated. There were token Indians present at Columbus Day and Thanksgiving celebrations, and some Indian women sitting at Santa Fe railroad stations selling pottery. But for most, American Indians had ceased to exist. It is difficult to describe just how America began to embrace Indians again in recent years. When the Indian protests began in the 1960s, white Americans learned that in the remote canyons of the West, the swamplands of the Great Lakes, and the southeastern United States were seemingly thousands upon thousands of Indians. Perhaps their first response was a sense of outrage and shock. Where were these angry Indians coming from, and what was their gripe? They soon discovered that Indians had enjoyed treaty rights for nearly a century. They learned that as resources had been gobbled up by urban America, they were now in conflict with American Indians over the remaining natural resources of the continent, the best of which were in Indian hands. The initial tendency of many whites was simply to demand that these resources be taken and the Indians be moved into the mainstream of white society, thereby removing their legal rights to these lands. Needless to say, these same officials did not demand that African Americans and Chicanos or Hispanic Americans be given the same rights as whites. They were not sitting on oil, water, and mineral resources. White America only agitated to take away whatever land, whatever rights Indians still had. Always, this pressure was disguised on the argument that all people, being citizens, should enjoy the same basic rights. Thus, where Indians had preserved hunting and fishing rights, the right to self-government, tax exemptions on the land, the power to zone reservation lands, the cry was to bring about equality. At the county and town level, where Indians did not have employment, housing, equal criminal justice, and social equity, there was no corresponding effort to provide these things that allegedly all Americans enjoyed. In the 1860s, conditions were terrible for American Indians. The California Indians, for example, had been systematically neglected by generations of state and federal bureaucrats. In the 1850s, the federal government had signed a series of treaties with the bands and communities of Indians in California. These treaties gave the Indians clearly defined reservations in certain areas of the state, primarily in places not wanted by the whites, or at that time inaccessible to them. But as gold fever grew in intensity and mining technology grew more sophisticated, arriving settlers began to prowl the length and breadth of the state looking for gold. The miners' objection to the federal effort to preserve the Indian ancestral lands were loud and violent. The miners embarked on a program of systematic genocide against the Indians of California, going so far as to have Sunday shoots in which bands of whites would attack Indian villages, killing as many people as they could. Tribes were massacred to prevent them from holding their lands intact and out of reach of the gold-crazed miners. Political pressure was intense in Washington, D.C., and the California Indian treaties were never ratified by the U.S. Senate. Instead, they were conveniently buried in Senate archives, where they remained as classified documents for half a century. By the 1960s, most whites in California were not aware of the treatment of the indigenous peoples and had not the faintest idea that they had made treaties with clearly defined boundaries. State and government officials were not so innocent, however. During the Great Depression, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, was given orders to find lands for many homeless California Indians who now lived in tiny pockets of poverty on the outskirts of cities in the extreme southern and mountainous northern parts of the state. Agriculture was having a difficult time of it during the Depression, and so the program was used to assist wealthy white landowners, primarily ranchers and farmers, instead of the Indians. Lands classified as submarginal, lands that the Department of Agriculture believed could not support a family farm or ranch, were purchased from the whites to prevent their bankruptcy and given to the Indians. Some Indians did move to these lands, and the BIA organized them as tribal governments under the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. Then they were largely abandoned by the federal government because the populations of most of these new reservations were so small that the national programs could not reach them. During World War II, a number of Indians came to the West Coast to work in war industries. After the war, they were shunted aside as returning white veterans were given back their jobs. In the 1950s, in order to get Indians off their reservations so that the lands could be sold and the tribal existence terminated, the BIA began a massive relocation program that placed thousands of Indians in low-paying jobs in the urban area of California, primarily Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. By the 1960s, this mixture of original California Indians and newly migrated Southwestern and Plains Indians formed a community to assert their Indian identity. Thus, the first stirrings of what became known as the Indian movement began. In almost every part of the nation, Indians were treated with disgust and disdain by the whites of their region. South Dakota, the beautiful land of Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves, was littered with signs reading, "No dogs and no Indians allowed." Oklahoma systematically oppressed Indians, while on festive occasions its politicians laid claim to Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw bloodlines from mythical princes who had saved a wandering white man who startlingly resembled Gary Cooper. If Oklahoma Indians realized the repressive conditions under which they lived, many simply accepted the Indians' fortunes were supposed to be harder than whites because Indians were stupid. However, most of the Oklahoma tribes maintained their own societies and ceremonies, belying the myth of inferiority that kept them in social and economic bondage. Most Eastern Indians, with the exception of the Six Nations, whose cultural survival was chronicled by Edmund Wilson in his best-selling book Apologies to the Iroquois, simply did not admit to an Indian identity to avoid being singled out for discriminatory treatment. They kept most of their traditions to themselves and were highly suspicious of outsiders, but their history was beyond dispute in most instances. The Tunicas of Louisiana, for example, could trace their political lineage back to the days of the French occupation of the Mississippi Valley. The Passamaquoddies and the Penobscots of Maine still possessed a letter from George Washington that he sent at the beginning of the Revolutionary War asking them to please side with the colonists. In the Southwest, most of the tribes were just beginning to discover the invading white urban society around them. On the Navajo, Papago, and Apache reservations, the majority of people were full-bloods, spoke their own languages, and practiced traditional religions. A surprising number had only seen one or two whites in their lives, usually the local BIA agent or school teacher. In the Pacific Northwest, the Indians struggled with fish and game agencies to preserve their treaty fishing rights. Washington State was systematically breaking the 6 treaties signed with the Indians between 1854 and 1855. These agencies claimed that it was necessary to curb Indian fishing for conservation purposes. At the same time, they allowed commercial and sports fishermen to take almost all the annual salmon run. The Great Lakes Indians were living on barren reservations doing odd jobs for local whites. Their lands had been stripped of prime timber during the 1890s when the Timber Ring had worked with the BIA to strip the Indian forests on the pretext that removing the trees would enable Indians to become farmers. In 1964 and 1965, there were some fish-ins in Washington state along the Nisqually River, one featuring Marlon Brando and Dick Gregory. It was clear to careful observers that Indian country was about to explode. But the first significant protest occurred in Canada in 1968, when Canadian officials demanded that the Mohawks pay tolls to use a bridge and pay custom on goods brought back from the United States. On December 18, 1968, the Mohawks, led by militant Continetta Horn, a former actress and model, blockaded the Cornwall Bridge, claiming Canada had violated the Jay Treaty of 1794. They were arrested and tried in March 1969. But the prosecutor levied wild charges, and the Indians were acquitted. The incident, widely reported in Akwesasne Notes, a national Indian newspaper, inspired Indians all across the United States to take a closer look at the protests. Pressure continued to build. The next major eruption occurred in Gallup, New Mexico in August 1969. Gallup is a study in contrast. It proudly brags that it is the Indian capital of the world. The town is almost totally dependent on its Indian trade. Yet it systematically brutalizes its Indian population and excludes them from participation in most civic events. The National Indian Youth Council, some of whose members had been active in the fish-ins, protested the holding of the Gallup ceremonial in the summer of 1967 by passing out mimeographed leaflets denouncing the festival. The leaflet was titled, "When Our Grandfathers Had Guns," and refuted the happy image of smiling Indian pottery vendors that the Chamber of Commerce wished to perpetuate. It also protested that the ceremonial was largely controlled by non-Indians who gave minimal support to Indian participants in the festival. This protest shocked the older Indians who had placidly accepted life in Gallup and felt confused about the fuss the young people were making. From the Indian standpoint, the protest was a tremendous success because it was the younger generation that had taken a positive, aggressive step in resolving local problems of discrimination. The Pacific Northwest had its share of problems. The Quinault tribe had been pleading with non-Indians to refrain from littering its beaches, but to no avail. Owning 29 miles of the last good stretch of the beach in the area, the tribe wanted to protect its resource. But non-Indian tourists wandered over the area, removing large quantities of driftwood and stealing or destroying Indian fishing nets. In 1969, the tribe closed the beaches to the public. White response was quick in coming. Petitions were sent to the governor asking him to institute legal proceedings against the tribe. Then Attorney General Slade Gorton, now U.S. Senator, said he didn't think the tribe had the unchallenged right to exclusive control of the beaches. He was ready to go to federal court to defend the right of non-Indians to litter and destroy, but the beaches remained closed. These actions dealt primarily with local problems. They inspired Indians across the continent to defend their rights. But what was needed was some national symbol, a rallying point that could launch a national movement. At the end of October 1969, a large convention of urban Indian groups met in San Francisco to discuss their problems. The night after the convention dispersed, the Indian Center caught fire and burned completely, a singularly tragic event for the Indian population in the Bay Area because social service programs and powwows were run out of the center for more than 2 decades. They were suddenly without a meeting place, looking across the Bay of Alcatraz with its massive buildings sitting empty. The Indians knew they had found their national cause. Securing Alcatraz for Indian use was an old goal of the Bay Area community. After the prison had been closed in 1964, Alan Cottier, Dick Mackenzie, and Adam Nordwall, 3 Indians living in the area, had landed on the island and claimed it under the 1868 Sioux Treaty, but there had been no effort to occupy the island. On November 9, 1969, a small contingent of Indians landed on the island and spent several exciting hours being chased by the security guards. They were taken off the island the next morning. Not the least bit discouraged, they regrouped and 10 days later landed 200 people and secured the prison. Calling themselves the Indians of all tribes, they issued a proclamation asking for title to the island so it could be used for a spiritual center, university, and social service center. They compared Alcatraz to most Indian reservations. No water, no good housing, land unfit for civilization, no employment, in short, a prison. Although the composition of the group continued to change, Indians occupied the island for about a year and a half. By then, other developments had taken the spotlight. During their tenure, however, they were visited by movie stars, appeared on Merv Griffin talk show, and had a boat donated to them by Creedence Clearwater Revival rock group. Indians in the Seattle area adopted the Cognomen Indians of all tribes and invaded Fort Lawton on the northwestern corner of the city of Seattle during the winter of 1970. Jane Fonda, who had come to Seattle to protest the Vietnam War, participated in the invasion and helped to bring TV publicity to the protest. Rejecting the idea of claiming the fort under the 1868 Sioux Treaty, the Seattle Indians used an old federal statute that allowed the use of abandoned federal military posts as Indian schools. Negotiating aggressively, the Seattle Indians were able to secure a long-term lease on some of the land and then built the Daybreak Star Center, which is still a major part of the social services available to the Puget Sound Indian community. Invasions now seem to come from every direction. The Six Nations landed protests on Stanley Island that formed part of the St. Regis Mohawk Reserve. The island extended a short distance into the St. Lawrence River and had been leased by the government in 1900 to an American citizen for the magnificent sum of $6 a year. Lots on the island were worth upwards of $20,000 for use for summer cottages. Involved in this protest was the question of whether or not the Six Nations were joint conquerors of Canada during the French and Indian War and therefore co-owners of the Dominion. Therefore, the protest had a practical and historical and ideological dimension both. The summer of 1970 saw a full national Indian movement in action. Protests were happening in the most unexpected places and with irrefutable historic claims made by individual tribes. There was no sense of national coordination, and the issues appeared to be a conglomerate of local complaints, which taken together could be resolved only with great difficulty. It was apparent, however, that beneath all of these local protests, there was the important issue of restoring the old ways and raising the question of people and their right to a homeland. For Indians, this meant a return to the ceremonial use of lands. In June 1970, the Pitt River Indians tried to reclaim their ancestral lands from the Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Led by Richard Oakes, Mickey Gemmell, who had been active at Alcatraz, a task force of Indians occupied lands near Big Bend, California. The Indians fully intended to reinstate traditional religious life because the lands were near Mount Shasta, the center of the ceremonial life. Although arrested and charged with trespass, they were acquitted because no one wanted to bring up the treatment under the 1850s California treaties and the manner in which the California Indians were all lumped together in the California land claim. In another urban center, the Chicago Indians established an Indian village as a protest against housing discrimination in that city, pointing out that they had been forced into the cities because their lands had been taken by the government in the Menominee Termination, an allotment of the small Wisconsin forest reservations. This protest was very important because it linked urban Indians and the old policies of the government, particularly those that forced Indians to leave their lands in rural areas. In an ideological structure, the Chicago protests finally put together easily articulated complaints against historic and existing BIA policies. The movement had its humorous moments. The Indians in Milwaukee spread the rumor that they were going to invade the Milwaukee Yacht Club so they could have red suns in the sail set. But it was a rumor and nothing more. At the encouragement of some of the aggressive Lutheran pastors working with Indians, the American Indian movement occupied a dormitory at Augustana Lutheran College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. During a conference of the National Council of Churches in the last summer to protest against the church's lethargy in assisting Indians, the pastors wrote up a list of unnegotiable demands that they pass through a back window to the protesters so that the Indians learned why it was they had been protesting. Negotiations resulted in the establishment of community development funds and a Lutheran National Council of Indians to supervise spending it. In the Pacific Northwest, the Indian fishing rights cause was a continuing problem, originating with the treaties by which the whites gained a title to lands in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho in 1854 and 1855. Isaac Stevens negotiated a series of treaties that guaranteed Indians the right to fish in their traditional sites. As soon as whites discovered the income in fishing, they began to push Indians aside. Numerous Supreme Court cases clearly supported the Indian rights, but each succeeding state government found a way to quibble about the interpretations of the language in the treaties, resulting in Indian arrests and attempts to get the federal courts to override the treaty provisions. Particularly annoying were the Nisqualales and the Puyallups, who now clung to the riverbanks, making a living by fishing. They had lost most of their lands to the whites through the forced sale of their allotments. In a continuing and escalating series of fishing rights confrontations, just after Labor Day in 1970, a fishing camp was set up near Tacoma, Washington. The Indians, primarily from the Nisqually and the Puyallup tribes, were busy fishing and making preparations to take the fish back to their homes. Almost 300 Tacoma City police, state game wardens, and state police silently surrounded the camp. They trained telescopic rifles on the adult males who could be easily seen from the bushes in which the police force was hidden. Then the raid began. Tear gas was thrown into the camp, and the Indian fishermen and women were rushed and brutally beaten. As many as 6 policemen grabbed little Allison Bridges, a slip of a girl weighing less than 100 pounds and standing just above 5 feet tall, threw her to the ground and handcuffed her. People in the camp were arrested for disorderly conduct, although the disorder was police-inspired. The camp was leveled. The Indians' cars were impounded and taken to Tacoma, where they were virtually destroyed while in police custody. Dick Cavett allowed me to show pictures of the attack on the Indian camp on his national television show, resulting in a great public outcry against the actions of the police. As a result of the pressure, the federal government filed suit against the state of Washington and eventually won a ruling that entitled Indians of the state to receive an allocation of half the fish in the state. When the trials of the Indian fishermen began, it turned out that the arrests were illegal because neither the city of Tacoma nor Washington state had jurisdiction over the lands where the fishing camp was located. The question of jurisdiction continued to plague everyone, and the Puyallup tribe began to negotiate with the city of Tacoma and the federal government to clarify jurisdiction. Finally, in the late 1980s, a settlement was worked out in which the tribe received over 150 million in additional land in exchange for modifying its reservation boundaries. The combination of these two developments, the winning of the fishing rights case and the settlement of the Palayu boundary, put sufficient pressure on the state of Washington that it sought to create better relations with the tribes. In 1990, it established a form of tribe-state compact with mutual recognition of each other's political status. Today, the state is seen as the most progressive of Western states in its relations with Indians. As 1971 opened, it became apparent that the issue of grave robbing had not yet satisfactorily resolved. Some whites had taken to heart the pleas and logic of some of the Indian protests, and an interest and awareness of Indian issues was rising dramatically across the nation. But most whites still did not know how to relate to living Indians. Their education had taught them almost all the Indians were dead, so they promptly began to search for dead Indians. The results were confusing and devastating. In early June, an Indian skeleton was uncovered on Cemetery Road near Lowville, New York. It was promptly taken in by the Lewis County Historical Society as an artifact. Mohawk Chief Sakowinawong asked for the skeleton back. Many times, people of the sciences do not respect the dead, and instead of making matters right, cause further difficulties by taking the bones into their own homes and places of work, storing them there, or bothering them further, he wrote to Arthur Einhorn, curator of the Lewis County Historical Society. Einhorn was sensitive to Mohawk argument and used his influence to get the skeleton returned. The Mohawk took the bones to the reservation and conducted the proper burial ceremonies. In Minnesota, budding anthropologists and archaeologists were not so enlightened. In mid-June 1971, 45 students from the Minneapolis area, sponsored by the Twin Cities Institute for Talented Youth, went to Welch, Minnesota to begin a 6-week project in excavating the site of an Indian village. The motivation for the students' fieldwork was puzzling. Apparently, they may have been led to believe that digging up Indian remains was a form of showing respect. The students dug for about 5 weeks, carefully collecting materials and classifying them as artifacts. The Indians of Minnesota were outraged by the excavations. They believed that the dead should be left alone. AIM, led by Clyde Bellecourt, invaded the site one evening. They took shovels away from the students, filled in the trenches, burned the excavation notes, and offered to compensate the students for property losses. They did not, however, want any further digging. They did not believe their ancestors had buried their dead for the express purpose of providing summer adventures. The archaeologist directing the dig could not understand the viewpoint of the AIM members. Les Peterson, a Minnesota Historical Society member who had headed the excavation, declared 5 weeks of work down the drain, indicating that the moral question of disturbing the dead eluded him. The students also failed to comprehend the problem. One student who had been planning a career in archaeology said the incident made her lose respect for Indians. Another student was in tears as she tried to explain how carefully the students had treated the materials they uncovered. Another student explained that they were trying to preserve Indian culture, not destroy it. None of the whites could understand that they were not helping living Indians preserve their culture by digging up the remains of a village that had existed in the 1500s. Daniel Dalton, assistant AIM program director, said that if the situation were reversed and Indians were digging up the site of a white colonial settlement, all hell would have broken loose. The general attitude of the whites, however, was that they were the true spiritual descendants of the original Indians, and that the contemporary Indians were foreigners who had no right to complain about their activities. Everyone in Minnesota took sides in the dispute. Few non-Indians understood the Indian objections, and because Minnesota was at the time trying to levy an additional tax on Indian reserves, it was apparent that the only Indians worth preserving were dead ones. Minnesota was a hotbed of compassion, however, in comparison to its neighbor in Iowa. In June 1971, the State Highway Department began a new road project about 2.5 miles from Glenwood, Iowa. Work progressed until one day a bulldozer uncovered an unmarked cemetery. It was quite old. The bodies were only about 6 inches beneath the topsoil. Ernest Baker, a longtime inhabitant of the area who lived nearby in Pacific Junction, estimated that the cemetery was at least a century old because he thought his grandmother and 3 of her children had been buried there in 1867. As the road work continued, bits of tombstones and the bodies of 27 people were uncovered. One of the bodies was buried with several hundred glass beads, some brass fingertips, and metal earrings. This body was tentatively identified as the remains of an Indian girl, although there was absolutely no way that any positive identification could be confirmed. No such artifacts were discovered with the bodies under the other tombstones. The remains of the other 26 bodies were reverently taken to the Glenwood Cemetery and reburied. The remains believed to be an Indian girl had another destination. State archaeologist Marshall McCusick demanded that the bones be sent to him under the provisions of an Iowa law that entrusted him with the articles of historical importance. Running Moccasins, an Indian woman concerned about discrimination, demanded that the bones, considered those of an Indian girl, be given proper burial after she discovered that they had been taken to Iowa City for a museum exhibit. She called McCusick's office several times, but he refused to answer her calls. When asked about his stand on the matter, McCusick replied, "I don't want that woman to think in any way that if she raises a fuss, I'll give her a couple of boxes of bones." Running Moccasins appealed to Governor Robert Ray, who suddenly became too busy to see her and allowed his aides to turn her pleas aside. McCusick remained formally committed to his stand, claiming, "I just can't go giving remains to private individuals. It sounds nice to say, just give them back to the Indians so that the girl can be reburied, but I have to follow the code of Iowa law." Later, McCusick said that it would take a court order from him to release the remains of the tribe to which the girl belonged. Apparently, he was unable to discover the tribes to which the 26 white bodies had belonged. Rather than place all the bones down at Iowa City, he took the Indian remains to his museum, allowing the bones of the whites, under which the Code of Iowa were of no historical significance, to be reburied at the Glenwood Cemetery. The ironic part of this controversy is that there was no proof other than the jewelry that the skeleton was that of an Indian. It might just as well have been that of Ernest Barker's grandmother, because whites had glass beads and brass finger rings also. But the fact that it might have been an Indian skeleton meant discriminatory treatment. By early 1971, Indians were on the defensive all over the country, trying to prevent the looting of their burial grounds. Whites were just as determined to preserve Indian culture on their terms, even if they had to dig up every Indian skeleton on the continent. Near Fredericktown, New York, the Abenaki Archaeological Society continued its excavation of an old Abenaki village site, uncovering its ninth body in less than a year. A story about Abenaki in early September in the Philadelphia Inquirer optimistically related that the digs would reveal a cross-section of Indian life and not just burial patterns. It would have been nice if the settlers in the region had learned something from the Abenaki when they were contemporaries, so that the dig would not have been necessary. In neighboring Pennsylvania, the looting of Indian graves became a community function. The archaeology section of the William Penn Memorial Museum in Harrisburg uncovered 3 Susquehannock villages near Paxton. 4 graves containing 2 infants and 2 adults were exposed. In an interview with the Paxton Herald, Ira F. Smith III, expedition leader, declared the West Branch project an overwhelming success, not only from the scientific standpoint, but also from the human interest it generated. He applauded volunteer participation from local residents who usually fail to comprehend the purpose of field explorations and seem to resent such a presence in their locality. There was great historic irony in these tender excavations to learn about the Susquehannock Indians. On December 14th and 27th, 1764, a local group known as the Paxton Boys massacred 2 villages of Christian Indians, accusing them of aiding the tribes on the frontier in sporadic attacks on the settlements. After the 2 massacres, the Paxton Boys marched in Philadelphia, where some 500 Christian Indians had been taken by the Moravians for safety, and announced to Governor John Penn they were going to kill every Indian in Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin helped to turn aside this slaughter. So little over 200 years later, the great-grandsons of the Paxton Boys were at it again. In Illinois, the Field Museum of Natural History was not to be left behind in the race to uncover Indian skeletons. Anthropology students digging under museum auspices unearthed the remain of 9 Indians buried under a motorcycle path in a forest preserve. The museum made its find public with glowing reports that the bodies were those of Miami Indians of the late 17th century. Since the Miamis used to live in Indiana before they were forced to move to Oklahoma, the museum made plans to ship the remains to Indiana University for display. But the Chicago Indians arrived at the museum to confront Dr. Ronald Collier, museum curator. Matthew Warbonnet, leader of the Indian delegation, demanded that the bones be given to the group for a ceremonial burial in a Winnebago burial ground in Wisconsin. The museum agreed, and the Indians took the bones to Wisconsin Dells and held a burial ceremony. The museum paid for the evening ceremonial fire, hired a medicine man to perform the ceremonies, and provided gifts to be given at the ceremonies. The museum wryly noted that despite providing financial support for the Indians, it did not want to be considered a soft touch, indicating that this was a one-time arrangement. But the Field Museum was headed in the right direction. Later in 1989 and 1990, its representatives participated in an Indian museum dialogue that led to national legislation repatriating human skeletal remains to the tribes. Reports were that Field was played a major role in bringing the museum community to see the Indian point of view. The final bizarre and perhaps fitting touch to this summer of looting Indian graves was the invasion of a century-old Nez Perce burial ground near Clarkston, Washington. Thieves invaded the sacred grounds, drove rods into the ground to locate the coffins of the Indians. Then they dug up the graves to take any jewelry that might have been buried with the bodies. The Indian skulls were stolen, many of them severed from the rest of the body and sold in an underground market in California, where they brought as much as $20 apiece. A white dentist paid an exorbitant price for the skull of Chief Joseph, beloved leader of the Nez Perce. The grave robbing can be seen in another more profound and very disturbing light. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, suggested that we have a collective unconscious that lies behind, under, and in support of our conscious ego personality. In his Wotan essays, Jung related that he was able to predict the rise of National Socialism by analyzing the dreams of young Germans shortly after World War I. He suggested that at times an idea or archetype might sweep into the consciousness of many individuals who were otherwise not known to each other nor related in any way, and inspire or motivate them to perform simultaneously certain actions that they did not really understand. If the propensity of whites during the summer of 1971 to grasp some bit of authenticity by locating, excavating, and embracing Indian skeletal remains can be interpreted as a frantic attempt to discard their own physical, cultural, and spiritual heritage, then the collective psyche of white America was indeed in deep trouble. The outburst of grave robbing seemed to end abruptly after 1971, and the nation began to see sporadic killings of Indians. Early in 1972, 5 white men captured Raymond Yellow Thunder, a 51-year-old Sioux from the Pine Ridge Reservation in Gordon, Nebraska. They severely beat him, stripped him of his clothes below the waist, and pushed him into an American Legion hall where a dance was in progress. Yellow Thunder thus became the grotesque amusement of white veterans his own age who had fought in World War II and Korea to protect American rights and liberties, including Yellow Thunder's rights and liberties. But the whites had no concept of these same rights applied to Indians. Yellow Thunder later died from this abuse. AIM was furious over the Yellow Thunder incident and called on the Nebraska Human Rights Commission to do something. When it refused to consider the complaint, AIM sent out a call for protesters, and more than 2,000 Indians swarmed into Gordon demanding justice. Federal authorities, who usually investigate civil rights crimes, decided they had no jurisdiction, even though federal law requires the Justice Department to protect Indians. After much confusion, stalling, and passing the buck from one level of government to another, the whites responsible for this tragedy were charged on lesser counts and tried in Alliance, Nebraska, a town almost as notoriously anti-Indian as Gordon. Within weeks of the Yellow Thunder episode, Indians were killed in California and Arizona under suspicious circumstances. Russell Means and Oglala Sioux and one of the leading AIM officers urged a march on Washington to demand a federal law that would make it a crime to kill an Indian if it had to be as an amendment to the Endangered Species Act. On a lonely piece of land in California, Richard Oakes, leader of the Alcatraz movement, was slain by Michael Morgan, a guard at a YMCA camp. Morgan claimed that Oakes had appeared from behind a clump of trees and had come menacingly toward him. However, there were no weapons found on or near Oakes at the time of the shooting. According to Indian witnesses, Oakes had gone to the camp to inquire about a young Indian boy who had had trouble with Morgan earlier in the week. Morgan was charged with involuntary manslaughter and set free on $5,000 bail. By early October 1972, plans were well underway to form a caravan to march on Washington and demand a new Indian policy. While there were still enough Indians alive to make it feasible, cars filled with Indians left the West Coast, visiting as many reservations as possible on their drive eastward. The march became formally designated as the Trail of Broken Treaties, because many of the complaints dealt with treaty violations. A major meeting was held in Minneapolis, where the Indians sought to clarify their objectives prior to reaching Washington. The famous 20 points were constructed here, a list of reforms that people wanted to see initiated. The march reached Washington, D.C. on Friday before the national elections and immediately got into trouble. Advance men, headed by Robert Burnett, a Rosebud Sioux, had not made any provisions for housing and feeding the people. There was no place for the 600-member contingent to stay. The leaders met with the Commissioner Louis Bruce in the BIA headquarters on November 2nd. As they were beginning to leave the BIA building, a scuffle broke out between the younger Indians and the federal building guards. Fearing mass arrest, the police brutality, the Indians seized the building and began a wild weekend in which office furniture and BIA files were destroyed. Operating behind the scenes, the White House was able to get the Indians to agree to vacate the building with the promise of a $66,000 grant or bribe to cover travel expenses. After a week of occupation, before they left the Bureau, and the day before the election, some of the people moved a large number of files from the Bureau as hostages and hid them in obscure parts of the country, driving panel trucks filled with federal files from 15 to 18 hours to get far enough from Washington to make their escape complete. Later, Hank Adams, one of the leaders of the caravan and one of the outstanding proponents of fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest, would try to secure possession of the documents and be arrested along with Les Whitten, an aide to the Washington columnist Jack Anderson, who was doing a story on the occupation. The two men were held in jail while the FBI changed the arrest warrants made out for Jack Anderson, who they had hoped to arrest instead of Les Whitten. According to the Washington Post, the occupation had done more damage to a federal building than the British burning of the White House in the War of 1812. Strangely, the public was in favor of the Indians. Several congressmen noted that their mail was running nearly 8-1 in favor of not prosecuting the activists. A few weeks after the occupation, some tribal chairmen known to be favorably inclined toward the government were given a tour of the building to see the destruction. While they condemned the occupation, they also pointed out that the obscene slogans painted on the walls had fresh paint, indicating that parts of the scenario had been staged for their benefit. The Indians went home. Many AIM members announced their intention to go to Pine Ridge and hold a victory celebration. But the government was ready for them. Funds had been given to Dickey Wilson, tribal chairman of the government at Pine Ridge, to increase its police force. Wilson hired a rough gang of reservation and border town toughs as his police. This special police force was soon harassing Wilson's political opponents, claiming they were AIM members. Through December and January, tensions quickly escalated at Pine Ridge. When efforts to impeach Wilson failed through procedural trickery, the situation reached the flashpoint for violence. Then Wesley Bad Heart Bull, an Oglala Sioux, was killed in a war in Buffalo Gap, South Dakota, when local police seemed hesitant about indicting his killer. An immediate storm of protest rose in western South Dakota, and a crowd of Indians went to the country seat in Custer to protest the police inactivity. Local and state police incited a riot during which a small Chamber of Commerce building was burned. The Indians then returned to Pine Ridge, and the county attorneys began writing up charges against the identifiable leaders of the group. Believing they had to make some kind of stand against the treatment they were receiving, in February 1973, a large contingent of Sioux Indians and their supporters marched in and occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and a small settlement consisting primarily of a trading post, a church, and a few houses. The move was a public relations coup. Most of the reading public were familiar with the massacre of Sioux Indians at Wounded Knee just after Christmas 1890, as a result of D. Brown's popular bestseller, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. No one wanted a replay of that tragedy. The local tribal police, nicknamed the Goon Squad, quickly surrounded the village, and a standoff ensued. The next 2 months, I'm reading from God is Read by Vine Deloria. The next 2 months were both tragic and comic. Rumor had it that Lehman Brightman, an Indian activist from the West Coast, had 1,000 dog soldiers at Rapid City who were marching to the reservation to relieve the siege. Ralph Abernathy offered to intercede with President Nixon on behalf of the occupants of the village. Marlon Brando sent Shasheen Littlefeather to reject his Oscar and chastise the Hollywood community for its detrimental portrayal of Indians. Side note, Native peoples have called for a ban of Avatar 2 because while it's using Indigenous stories, there's not a single Indigenous person employed anywhere. It's the new Blueface. But Marlon Brando sends Shasheen Littlefeather to reject his Oscar and chastise the Hollywood community for its detrimental portrayal of Indians. The occupation was on national television almost every night. One evening, people saw network crews helping to slaughter local cattle to feed the people. Many people assumed that the Indians did not know how to butcher. In reality, this was a ploy so that the Indians were not seen butchering someone else's cattle in case they would be charged with rustling once the occupation was over. Sporadic efforts to settle the dispute marked the 2-month occupation. The White House played an active role in these efforts. Indeed, many people suspected that the incident was kept on the front pages so that the Watergate scandal, which was just breaking open, would not get national attention. In early May, the Indians surrendered on the promise that the White House would send out a delegation to discuss the violations of the 1868 Sioux Treaty. In June, representatives of the president did come to the reservation and hold talks with the traditional chiefs, but nothing came of the discussions. In 1974, AIM leadership trials began in St. Paul. The Indians had an outstanding defense team headed by William Nussler, and the government had planted an undercover agent, Douglas Durham, as an AIM security officer. Go and tell, bro. Everything the Indians did to plan their defense was known immediately to the government. The trial of Russell Means and Dennis Banks, two of the most vocal, charismatic Indian leaders, occupied headlines most of 1974. Although the government had a vast amount of incriminating evidence, it could not resist the temptation to make its case airtight. Consequently, federal officials altered evidence, subpoenaed witnesses to such a degree that Judge Nichols declared a mistrial. A high point of the trial was the testimony of the local Twin Cities FBI supervisor that he did not sign most of his correspondence, including Christmas cards that he sent Judge Nichols. Consequently, he did not recognize his signature on some of the sheets of tainted evidence. The Wounded Knee trials pretty much checkmated the Indian movement. Most of the leadership were spending their time in court or preparing to defend themselves. It was impossible for them to take part in protests. But Wounded Knee had been such a media spectacular that no protest could have had any greater impact. For purposes that were never made clear, FBI officers surrounded a home west of Pine Ridge in June 1975. The Indians, frightened by the presence of federal agents, fought back. 2 FBI men were slain, Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams. How those deaths came about is still vague. Peter Matthewson presents a reasonable sequence in his book, In the Spirit of Crazy Horse. But many questions remain. The agents' bodies had multiple wounds, but the evidence indicates that the Indians fled the scene of the killing rather quickly. This has led people to speculate if the FBI itself did not mutilate the bodies in order to enhance sympathy for the federal position. Several Indians were accused of the killings. Leonard Peltier was convicted of them. Mathewson outlines the many discrepancies and flagrant illegalities practiced by the federal government in order to get Peltier's conviction. However, all efforts to get Peltier a new trial have failed. He remains a prisoner in federal penitentiary to this day. The 2 measurable results came from the Wounded Knee occupation. In the summer of 1974, South Dakota Senator James Aborzik introduced the American Indian Policy Review Commission resolution in Congress, authorized a 2-year study of the conditions of Indians. Unfortunately, the commission's work was subdivided among 11 task forces organized by topics, and almost every Indian politician of note was placed on one of those task forces. In 1978, when the report was released, BIA employees were asked to write the final draft because there was so much material that the commission staff was overwhelmed. Thus, the perennial enemies of Indians became the people who articulated what their problems were. In the years following the Aborzik Commission, several small pieces of legislation were passed by Congress, including the American Indian Religious Freedom Resolution, which was considered critical to the protection of traditionals who continued the ceremony and ritual life of the tribes. The Indian Child Welfare Act, 1978, was also part of this reform legislation, as well as an effort to upgrade reservation community colleges. Perhaps just as important was the tendency in Congress to work out settlements of longstanding problems and solve them by passing settlement acts that avoided prolonged contentious litigation. Settlement involves handling a problem, water rights, quantification, identification of land claim areas, or solution of disputed boundary, by having the parties involved present a possible solution acceptable to all parties for consideration and passage by Congress as a statute, thereby avoiding a federal state course. The second result of the Indian activist movement was the tremendous surge of interest in traditional religions and customs. At the BIA occupation, and again during Wounded Knee confrontation, medicine men had been prominent in performing ceremonies for the activists. Leonard Crow Dog served some time in federal prison for his prominence in the protests of the 1970s. Frank Fools Crow, a leader of the traditional people at Pine Ridge, was the leading spokesperson during the meeting with White House officials in the summer of 1973. Years after Wounded Knee, Russell Means was asked what the beneficial results were, considering all the killings and violence that had infested the Pine Ridge Reservation during the 1973 and for years afterward. He told a little story of watching 3 little Indian boys playing. The 2 more aggressive boys chose to be Means and Banks. They pointed at the 3rd boy and said, "You have to be Dickie Wilson." The 3rd boy went home crying. He was ashamed to even pretend to be a traitor to his own people. Somehow, through all of the protests and symbolic gestures, a different sense of Indian identity was born. So there is chapter 1. This book is downloadable for free. Just type in God is Red PDF. The Indian Movement was chapter 1. So nothing new. But that whole era that we always think about is like, oh, what happened? Nothing came of it, but something did come of it. Something did come of the movements of the 60s and 70s. So that's awesome. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of this book. late, and it's the only words that I being pulled into or dragged into the natural state that we've been designed to be in as a human, which is the balancing of the divine masculine and the divine feminine. It's being in more of a feeling state instead of a thinking state, a mind state. It is trusting the flow of your life as opposed to forcing and controlling it. It is listening deeper to your intuition instead of other people. It is not feeling like you fit in at all, as if you're going against the grain of how the world is designed to work, as if you're crawling out of a room that has never really been yours. They want to go and cut trees down in April, right? So we need to protect our cultural sites. When I look out there, I go, do I allow this to happen in Casper 500? If we allow this to happen in Casper 500, we'll witness it. When you get out here, you're going to see it if you haven't already. The basis of this business perspective is you'll never move forward because all you're doing is taking. You're never going to get where you want to be. Right? You have to go back. Now we've got to figure out how to protect what's left. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, hello?
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Dan Chiavello. I'm calling from market research. We're conducting a very brief survey. Did you vote in the last election for Congress, governor, and other local offices?
No.
You did not vote. Do you plan on voting in June for city council?
No, I don't live there anymore.
Okay, thank you. We already did the vetting, we already did the studies, like, this works. What else?